Hello and welcome to another episode of the Architecture Foundation's Book Week 2023. Today I am joined by Samia Henni, who will be talking through the book Architecture of Counterrevolution, the French Army in Northern Algeria. And I'll pass it over to Samia, who will talk about the book. Thank you.
Thank you so much for including me in this series. I'm really delighted to be able to introduce you Architecture of Counterrevolution, the French Army in Northern Algeria, which was published by the Goethe Verlag in Zurich in 2017 in English. And then it was translated into French and published by Édition B42 in Paris in 2019. The book is a version or a reworked, re-edited version of my PhD dissertation, which was much thicker. So I was really able to make it shorter, which I defended in 2016 at the Goethe Institute, so the Institute for the History and Theory of Architecture at the ETH in Zurich. Let's say the driver of the book came from a law that was, let's say, decreed, yes, in 2005 in France by the Assemblée Nationale, so the National Assembly in France, and it says that, I'm quoting here, and you can see the text directly, that school programs recognize in particular the positive role of French presence overseas, notably in North Africa, and concede to history and the sacrifices of the combatant of the French army in this territory the eminent position to which they had the right. So for me, the term positive is very disturbing. If it's a law, it means that whoever discusses or researches the non-positive role of French colonialism in North Africa becomes a criminal. So I really tried to find ways to discuss this non-positive role of French colonialism, specifically in architecture and urban development and urban planning, specifically in Algeria. The law lasted for 1 year, thanks to various protests and petitions. The French General Assembly deleted this term positive, but for me, the fact that this was passed and this was part of the French law for 1 year, and the fact that it passed, it's really part of this colonial attitude and the colonial mind that is still occupying many European and North American governments and institutions around the world. So I really tried to focus on the non-positive role of colonialism, but I also wanted to try to understand how does armed conflict influence the built and destroyed and imagined environments, this is how I also define architecture. Knowing that the Algerian Revolution, which I will discuss in a minute, was not named as Algerian Revolution, Algerian War of Independence, but it was called the Events of Algeria. And this is a quote from Roland Barthes that he published in the 50s. This is a translation into English, but the book or the mythology in French and African grammar was a chapter in that book. He argued that war, the goal is to deny the thing. For this, two means are available: either to name it as little as possible, most frequent procedure, or else to give it the meaning of its contrary, more cunning procedure, which is at the basis for almost all the mystifications of bourgeois discourse. So war is then used in the sense of peace and pacification in the sense of war. So for me, this was a very, these two, let's say, notions, so the non-positive and the war, the unnamed war, were really at stake in this book, Architecture of Counterrevolution, which is somehow framed around the Algerian Revolution or the Algerian War of Independence that started in 1954 and ended in 1962. This was a war between the French army and the Algerian liberation fighters, who were also helped by other international forces as well. I wanted to really understand the intersection of architecture and space making with colonial practices and military measures. That's also why I called it counter-revolution, because the Algerian forces or the Algerian people were waging the revolution, and the French were trying to counter that revolution. And this is also why it's called Architecture of Counterrevolution. So it's the French architecture in Algeria during the Algerian Revolution or the Algerian War of Independence. And the role of the space and architecture in this very moment was really crucial. As you can see here, there are two ideal territories, one for the insurgent. In this case, I'm quoting here David Galula, who is a French military officer who wrote a book titled Counterinsurgency while he was a fellow in the US at Harvard. He argued that the ideal territory for the Algerian, in this case, the insurgencies, is his terms, is exactly what you can see in the left-hand side. You know, they have this extremely let's say, demarcated territory, and the settlements are scattered. And the ideal territory for the counterinsurgent, in this case, the French army, is really a sealed and a very defined territory that can be controlled and can be somehow, as to use a French term, penetrated. So this counterinsurgency, as the French call it, or counter-revolution, as others call it, you know, it was also called subversive warfare, guerrilla warfare, asymmetric warfare, but the French also called it total warfare. And here is a quote by a colonel, Lacharrois, who says that the war was total because not only does it mobilize in this effort all of the industrial, commercial, and agricultural powers of a country, but it also takes up in the war effort all women and children and elderly men, all who think, all who live, all who breathe, with their forces of love and their forces of enthusiasm, all their forces of hate, and it throws them into war. This is a new reality. Total war, because it takes the souls as well as the bodies, and it yields them to the obedience of the war effort. So this is, as we can see here, it's a total warfare that affects the entire population. So there is no boundary between friends and enemy, and everyone becomes a suspect. So architecture, when everyone becomes a suspect, architecture and special measures are really crucial. And I try to study this, and this is what the book is also trying to do. It's divided into 10 chapters. I start with the very first camps, the camps that the French called the camps de regroupement, and they end with the construction of a big new town that the French built for themselves in order to protect their population from the violence of the war. So we really have all kinds of scales of architecture, from the camp, the housing, the slums, the bidonville, the village, mass housing projects, but also a new town called Rocher-Noir. I will give you very few examples so that you have really an overview of the intersection of military measures, colonial practices, and with architecture. I start with maybe the most unlike the most maybe I don't know if you can say weird, but unexpected, let's say, this is the term that I was trying to find, the most unexpected special measure, which is the construction of housing units during the war. So this started in 1958 when General Charles de Gaulle came back to power, and he used the natural resources that were being extracted in the south of Algeria, in the Sahara, so oil and gas, and implemented very large housing project or projects actually. So he wanted to build housing for 1 million people during the war. I said unexpected because normally war is a synonymous of destruction. We can see it right now happening as I'm speaking. You know, people are dying as we speak with this herbicide and bombing of cities where civilian lives are being exterminated. And this is, let's say, the most common measure, war measure. And this large-scale housing projects that were part of what de Gaulle called the Plan de Constantine, so the construction of housing for 1 million people, happened during the war. So I tried to really understand how this was possible, how this oil and gas, natural resources were being extracted, and how their profit was used to build this very large-scale housing project. And for those who know the built environment in France, suburbia, so les grands ensembles, or this large-scale housing settlements, you see here we are in the 1960s. Some of these settlements were also being built in France as well. So in big cities, in satellite cities, or around large cities like Paris and Lyon and Marseille, you have this large-scale housing settlements. I also try in this chapter to understand the relationship between the so-called post-war, which is post-Second World War housing policies, and the relationship with the war policies, so the war in Algeria, so the Algerian Revolution or the French war in Algeria. So how these two policies were similar or different, and how they differed from one another. So there are a number of comparisons between housing units that were built in France after the Second World War and housing units that were built in Algeria, which was a French department at the time during the war. So you can follow us on some of the architectural practices, some of the policies, and one very important figure in all of this project was Paul Delouvrier, who is today known for the planning of the satellite towns around Paris. So he's really the father of les grands ensembles in Paris, and he was appointed as the implementer or the manager of the Plan de Constantine in Algeria during the war. So I really try to connect this circulation of knowledge from the colonies to the so-called metropole, so in this case to France. This is, of course, a very an important, let's say, political project. So this housing units that were being built during the war were also somehow used to justify the fact that France was still in Algeria, while other colonies around the world, or protectorates like Tunisia and Morocco, gained their independence in 1956, and other African and Asian countries also were gaining their independence from France and from Britain and from other European regimes and authorities. So this was really the Plan de Constantine, the construction of housing units for 1 million people, was very much justifying the presence of France in Algeria. And the justification was that most of the Algerian population were living in self-built settlements, what the French called the bidonville, so slums. And that the French governments are really trying to get rid of these settlements and build new settlements. And I show in this book that wasn't really what was happening on the ground. If these self-built settlements were mushrooming around most of Algerian cities, it was because the French did not build enough housing settlements for the Algerian at that time. So my light is okay. So this was the example of the housing units. Another example is this chapter number 9, Erecting Fortress Rocher Noir. This was built, a new town was built around 1961, when there was this French paramilitary terrorist group called the OAS, the Organisation Armée Secrète, so the French secret armed organization. And I show that for this new town, Rocher Noir, the French authorities appointed a Prix de Rome architect, de Oim de Marien, who designed this new town that was built in really record times, and all the resources were being moved and transferred to this new town for the French authorities who were in Algiers, and they have to somehow move out of Algiers because it became because of the guerrilla warfare, because of the urban warfare that became really a site of violence. So you have all the, if we compare the housing unit that I showed a minute ago and this units, you see the difference in housing. The difference in design, in the material construction that were being built. You also see that the architects that built the Plan de Constantine were more like technocrats, and the one that built this master plan or this new town, Rocher Noir, so Louis Gabriel de Homme de Marien, was somehow another category. So we see the hierarchies that the French authorities implemented or created in this two different sites. One for the Algerian people and the other one for the French people in the same, territory. So you see also this very clear apartheid between the two communities. And Jean-Jacques Deluz, who is a Swiss architect who went to Algeria to work there after he graduated from the EPFL in Lausanne, he wrote, and he was there. So by 1961, all credits were channeled to this false city. All operations were frozen to its advantage. De Marien, architect Prix de Rome, was appointed. They chose a site in eastern Algiers, accessible from the airport, but without contact with Algiers. Accessible to the airport, this is really strategic. So we think of this location. And Rocher Noir lived day and night in the fever of a delirious construction site, which was effectively completed within the allotted deadlines. Then the city became that which it was planned to be, a ghost town, abandoned in a grandiose landscape, but without poetry, without architecture, without history. So another and last example of architecture of counter-revolution are the history or the construction of regrouping camps, or what the French called les centres de regroupement. For those who maybe followed this work, I organized an exhibition called Discrete Violence, Architecture and the French War in Algeria, that traveled in 8 cities and 3 continents, and it was trying to really show and understand the construction processes of almost 4,000 camps that were built between 1954 and 1962. So I tried to understand this extremely difficult built environment, difficult because it is not built by architects, and it was the case with the Le Plan de Constantine and Rocher Noir. The archives are very, are accessible. This is more more military history of architecture. So one has to work on the Service Historique de l'Armée de Terre in order to be able to understand and to specialize and to bring it into architectural history. Between brackets, all the archives that were open to the public were classified. So they were declassified, but the French reclassified them in 2020. So most of the archives that are serving for these 3 chapters and that are stamped secret, top secret, or confidential, they were stamped in the 1950s and 60s today are not accessible to the public any longer. So they were until 2020, and the French closed this archive. So it's somehow an important, I think, aspect that this is now part of this book, but it cannot be anymore somehow, or one cannot really write on these camps any longer. So these three camps, the three chapters are really trying to understand what kind of camps and how did the French tried to implement this large scale policy that's, as I mentioned, that the French called les centres de regroupement, and I tried to show, again, thinking of the non-positive role of French colonialism, this is really about camps, regrouping camps. The term camp and term concentration were both forbidden, so they were not, the French army was not allowed to use these terms, and that's why they introduced the regrouping camps. And what happened is that when the revolution started, the French demarcated certain areas as forbidden zones, and they displaced all the people living there from those areas to new centers or new camps that they created. And any living being was forbidden somehow. Even animals were not allowed to be in this forbidden zones. So from these forbidden zones, here you can see in the darkest ground, these are all the zones. So they are really scattered around the most, let's say, remote areas around Algeria, mainly in the northern part of Algeria, but also along the border with Tunisia and Morocco. So all these inhabited areas had to be somehow cleared from beings, from any human and non-human beings. So here we can see that from those forbidden zones, we have almost 3,700, almost 4,000 camps. All numbers that I'm sharing with you are disputed, so we don't really know the exact numbers. But we can see from this, in this map, that every dot represents the camp, and the camps were not all similar. So we have very precarious camps, or some of the camps were built with construction materials, as you can see here. But there was a special unit called the SAS, Section Administrative Spécialisée, which was a military organization that was supposed to displace around, again, 3 million people. But again, all the numbers are disputed, so we don't really know how many, but there were really too many people. So this is one of the camps. So it's like very precarious. So we have tents. The area, as with Rocher Noir, which was close to the airport and also to the harbor, it was also by the sea. This is more an area that was isolated from the let's say villages where the Algerian population lived. It was isolated for the purpose that I will share with you in a minute, to really try to control the population. And in the Architecture of Counterrevolution, so the book, I'm trying to argue that this was not a policy that started there and finished or ended with the independence. This was a policy that started before the Algerian Revolution. So it started in the so-called Indochina war, and then continued. And so even after the independence of Algeria, the French, but also other powers like the US in Afghanistan and other armies around the world were also implementing this kind of policy. And this is a document of 2005 where the French were trying to advise or suggest a tool for the stabilization of Kosovo in the 1990s, but this was a document from 2005. So I really also tried to map the creation, the production of this knowledge, and then its transfer as well, and its circulation. So this is another of those camps. You can see clearly here a watchtower. In the archives, I was able to find, all these budget and forms that were supposed to be filled in order to order material constructions, and some of the voices were including barbed wire, but I wasn't able to find a picture that shows that. But this is one of very few pictures that show that there was a watchtower. Here, maybe you can see a bit this barbed wire, but you cannot see the whole camp, so it's not very clear where it started and where it ended. And this is another picture of one of these regrouping camps that the French called Centre de Regroupement, with a clear watchtower as well. So this was all this policy was implemented without the knowledge of the French public. But in 1959, there was a report that was leaked to French newspapers, and the secret special policy became known. So with this scandal, some of the newspaper articles were reporting that there was 1 million Algerian in these camps, in these regrouping camps. So what the French did, and this was, if you remember, I mentioned Paul de Louvrier, who was the father of Les Grands Ensembles in Paris, was in Algeria at that time, and he took this, or he proposed to turn these camps into villages. So he proposed this national policy of the 1,000 villages. It was a bit funny, unfortunately, even though it's ironically funny, because some of the French officers thought that they have to build 1,000 villages, and it wasn't only the name of it. So there was a lot of confusion as well among all the military, let's say, personnel there. And what's, I think, very important to, again, this interest of the architecture of counter-revolution, which is to map and try to understand the intersection between architecture and military operations and colonial practices. This is very an important, let's say, goal of these regrouping centers. And here I'm quoting from the service or from one of the military officers there, saying that the creation of the regroupment is the most effective means for subtracting the population from the influence of the rebels. And the rebels, in this very case, it's again the French speaking here, say that this is the rebels are the Algerian liberation fighters. So I think for me it was very important to show then, after this media scandal, how these camps became non-villages. I still argue that these are still camps. You can see that the scale of these camps was not maybe, but it was very different. You can see that these are much larger camps. You can see that there is a very clear plaza or square in the middle, so that helicopters can land, and the grid was also a very important architectural element that allowed people to be seen and to see others. I think this was also part of the whole planning strategy of these camps. This is another example. So I really tried in this very short presentation to give you an idea about architecture of counter-revolution, the French army in Northern Algeria. And I really tried to focus on Northern Algeria because what I'm working on right now, which is this upcoming book called Colonial Toxicity, Rehearsing French Radioactive Architecture and Landscape in the Sahara, which is more about the southern part of Algeria. But this book really focuses on the northern part of Algeria and tries to map and analyze the non-positive, just to quote the French legislators that passed the law in 2005, the non-positive role of French colonialism and the intersection between architecture, colonial measures, and military operation. Thank you very much, yes, for considering this book and for allowing me to presented here in this very venue.